Hello, everyone. Welcome to In No Particular Order for the month of August 2019. My name is Tyson, and joining me today, I've got David and our first guest star, Max, the voice actor for Sharp in SkyPyre's critically acclaimed Halen Ballad of the Blade Thief.
Hi.
Hello.
Good start. Just like,
I think it was critically acclaimed. I think it was acclaimed.
I mean, it's it's on the Bit website, so
and there were critics there,
yeah.
and they did like it. So, you know what? I'd say, yeah, it's critically acclaimed. Back on to
I mean,
topic, though.
everybody's a critic.
Back on to stuff. Back on to topic. This episode, we're going to talk about purity of vision in video games, which was a topic suggestion by Max. So Max, if you want to start us off with just an example or an explanation, I should say, of what you meant when you wrote that.
Yeah, for sure. It's an idea that's been kind of floating around in my head for a couple of years or so. And it kind of stems from the idea that I've played quite a lot of particularly indie games that have a very focused sort of identity of what they are and what sort of themes and mechanics they explore. And the one that I think really triggered this image in my head of game purity is Hyperlight Drifter. Um, because everything about that game, from its UI to its music, to the way that the story is told through without text, without voice acting, just through images, reinforces a lot of the core themes of that game. And with these sorts of with this sort of presentation, just suffusing everything, every aspect of that game. Like no matter where you are dropped into that game, if you're just watching footage of it, like if you just happen to see like 10 seconds of footage of someone playing Hyperlight Drifter and they're in the options menu, you still get a great sense of what sort of game it is.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Just the idea that if you sit down and design a game and you really focus on what this game represents and apply that to all other aspects, then your game is going to have a very strong identity.
Yeah, and you also talked about the idea that it's when you're, thinking about what mechanics are in there, what mechanics you're going to leave out, you really strongly consider the vision and like what you want the game to be.
Mm-hmm. And that kind
And,
of feeds into the same idea.
yeah, yeah. And the most interesting notion is that it's like, you can put something in, but you say, no, I'm not going to add this because it would dilute the game.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, that's a thing that a lot of AAA titles kind of ignored that notion.
Yeah, exactly. Many AAA games, because they need to play it safe, will include mechanics because, well, that's every other game of this genre, includes a crafting system or whatnot, or has a mini map, and like maybe that doesn't necessarily fit with what they're trying to do, but they're going to include it anyway to broaden the appeal.
Yeah,
Whereas an indie game which has much lower expectations of success and therefore is just doing it because the developer just wants to make a cool thing, is more likely to take a risk and just decide to do something that maybe doesn't necessarily make financial sense just because it helps create the game that they want to create with the vision that they have.
Right. So, David, maybe I
yeah.
don't know if this particularly applies, but there were definitely some like themes and motifs that you guys wanted to hit when you guys made Halen. Um, was there any sort of instance where there was maybe a feature that you thought might have been cool to add to the game, but you decided to leave out for the sake of the story or what the story you wanted to tell or the motifs you wanted to hit?
Um, that's a very good question. Um, I think I don't know. It was a while ago, obviously,
Yeah.
but mainly by the time we were, hmm, I can tell you that we did change mechanics to try to better fit like what the game was about. Maybe not necessarily like thematically because we had that all pretty set up, but a great example of changing mechanics in the game to try to like get to hone the vision, I guess you could say, is that we had a working version of Halen that did not have a wall run. It didn't have the thing where you could run up the wall and jump off. Instead, you could like jump, and then there was a wall grab. I might be remembering this wrong, but maybe we did have the wall run, but we also had a wall grab. But the things with the wall grab is that it was there, it worked, but it just slowed the game down. And the game was all about moving forward and moving up and moving quickly.
Just to clarify, do you mean that you would jump onto the wall and then you just hold the button to just stay exactly there so you could aim, like, jump off somewhere else? Yeah.
Exactly.
That's like a Spider-Man sort of mechanic.
Yeah. So it was this mechanic where you could grab onto the wall and then you could aim your gun out. And of course, here's the thing. Halen was actually not a great example of purity of vision, because I'd say that being able to aim your gun and like stand there and shoot at dudes from far away was kind of the opposite of what we really wanted with that game. But it was in there because that was an example of where at the beginning we're like, oh, these are cool mechanics. This is cool. Let's do this, right? And we didn't 100% until maybe it was too late take the time to be like, what do we really want to accomplish? Like, what do we want the identity of the mechanics to be?
That's quite interesting Sorry. Yeah, that's quite interesting from my point of view, because obviously I went through senior projects as well, and our game Metal Shepherd was built after Halen was made. So we saw a lot of those ideas, and we wanted to take our game in a different direction and whatnot. But we still had, I'm good friends with many of the members of SkyPyre, so it's like I hear a lot of these sorts of stories about we started off with these ideas and iteration, then we came up with this, and it's kind of funny how you still end up going through those same cycles, and no matter how well intentioned you are to start off with, you still go through that exact same process. And no matter how much thought you put in at the beginning, like, what are our core themes going to be? And, how are our mechanics going to tie into those themes? No matter how much you do that, it doesn't matter. You're still going to end up removing a core mechanic like 2/3 of the way through, because you're like, this is just bad. It doesn't feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, and there's, the games that succeed, games like Celeste, I'd say. Hyperlight Drifter is, of course, a good example.
Hollow Knight actually is another good example.
Hollow Knight, Into the Breach, just off the top of my head. These are all games that really they have basically little to no, I guess you could call it fluff, mechanically. Like, the game is trying to create a mood or a feeling, or it's trying to be about a specific mechanic or situation, and it is about that. Celeste is about platforming. It's razor focused on platforming and telling a very specific emotional story, which is, part of the platforming is all part of that. Or, Into the Breach, which is, this focused on being this tactics game, and it's focused on having this very specific feel, and it just hones in on that. And, actually there was a talk that I watched by the developers of that game where they talked about how they had all this complexity, they had all this stuff, and that maybe that could have made it a more like in-depth, complex, kind of thoughtful game. They took it out because they wanted to focus on just the core of it, and just to improve that one core of it.
Yeah, and that's a very difficult decision to make.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a medium-sized team, like with a senior project size group of like 4 to 6, that's a very difficult thing to do, because obviously everyone wants to include their ideas, and lots of people, and the nature of having multiple people working on one project is that the visions that each individual developer has is not going to align with any other one. They're going to have slight amounts of variation, which means that there are going to be people who have ideas that everyone else is just like, that won't fit. Yeah. Which is where conflict can come into play. But it's quite interesting if you've got a very small team like that, and they do decide, you know what, we're just not going to do this because it just is not what we want to do what we want to focus on, even though it's a cool idea, even though it's maybe it might even make the game better in a straight user experience fashion, but it might conflict with our vision for what it is.
Yeah.
And to elaborate on that further, actually, and this is why AAA games tend not to be able to achieve this level of vision and focus, is because there's hundreds of people working on this project, so it just sort of all dilutes until the vision just becomes this blurry sort of vague direction.
Yeah, and I think that there are, I guess you could say, I mean, I don't know. I guess there were AAA. I guess, yeah, okay. I'm sorry. Let me back up everything I just said. I think there are games that are not indie games that have succeeded at this.
Certainly, Dark Souls springs to mind in my eye.
Or Breath of the Wild.
Mm-hmm.
Not an indie game. But yeah, yeah, exactly. Those games. I can't really speak too much to Dark Souls, but Breath of the Wild is. I mean, on the face of it, you say, well, there's all kinds of stuff you're doing, right? There's like some quests and there's items and there's things, but it's all in this system, in this kind of this ecosystem, I guess you could say, of like mechanics and exploration, that it all fits together, and there's very little extraneous anything in that game. It all just is there to serve a very specific tone and mechanical environment.
Yeah, that's pretty much the idea that I had in terms of trying to describe this sort of a thing. Because I think it's a very good. I found it quite useful to think about this concept when I was working on Metal Shepherd. Because you come up with so many ideas, and especially when you're working on your first like full game, you have so many options, so many different directions you can go in. Having some way to filter and restrict it, and not feeling bad about cutting out ideas, is very important.
Yeah.
That's
definitely
the big thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you mind if I jump in? So.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that's like the big thing about working in a team project, right? Is like you said, Max. There's a lot of different people with different ideas and different visions of how things could progress. So like it's. You might create conflict when you're working on this one project, right? But maybe the idea works well in another project. So that's. I think that the biggest thing to realize with working in a team is, just because someone doesn't like your idea for that specific thing does not mean it's a bad idea, right? For example, let's say you're making like a third person cover shooter, right? And then someone says, "Oh, what if we add a little bit of like first person stuff in it?" That becomes a point where it's like, well, yes, but no, because that doesn't really fit in with the motif of the game, where it's supposed to be like the whole game is supposed to be third person over the shoulder. Yeah, maybe if you add the first person element, it makes things a little easier to shoot, but it doesn't really match. So maybe you hold on to that, and then the next game you work on is a first person shooter, and then you can put in all your neat ideas for that, right?
Yeah. That's a very important thing too, right? Is that plenty of the ideas you come up with that don't fit with your current game may very well be great ideas in the next game you work on. Mm-hmm. So it's important not to get disheartened by just having an idea shot down and then being like, okay, well, that was just a bad idea. And well, no, it wasn't a bad idea. It just was the wrong good idea for this particular problem.
Yeah, I think that especially in indie. In the indie zone, shall we say, I think that there can be fear that this game is the last game, because there's not necessarily the stability that you might have in a AAA environment.
It depends on what you're focusing on, I think, because I think anyone that likes making games is going to continue making games, whether or not it's like as a financial like full-time job or just in their hobby. Even if Sky, for instance, even if for whatever reason SkyPyre just like fell apart and that was that, odds are you all have ideas for like cool games, and you probably, as people that make games, you probably go off and still try and make them.
Yeah, that's probably true.
So I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's a risk of these ideas never being brought up again in the future, right? But I do take your point that there is a certain degree of like, am I even going to have time to do this? You know, because often, you know, you all got full-time jobs or whatnot, and you're not necessarily going to have the time to work on it, you know, and have a life.
I mean, it's just a well-known fact of being a game developer that you can't have a life if you're working on a game. It's just you just can't. It's you sit down, you work on a game, and that is your life.
Well,
well, I mean, according to some people's point of view, that is the way of the game developer. Ass in chair.
I mean, at the end of the day, that's because they're putting an awful lot of themselves into it.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's where like indie games and purity of vision can really shine out, where if it's something that you're very, very passionate about, then you won't want to stray too far away from the vision, right? Whereas if it's, you know, if you're just a guy that works at Ubisoft and you're working on the next Assassin's Creed game, it's like, yeah, whatever, it's a job. I mean, it's a cool job, but it's a job. It's not necessarily what I want to make. It's just a game that I am making.
Yeah, or more to the point, if you're working on something on your own as an individual and you don't have a clear idea as to what you're doing, you're just, I'm going to make a game. And then you sit down and you just spend, you know, 8 hours, you know, a day, twice a week, just working on your game without really a good idea as to what you want it to be about. You'll like end up with a lot of stuff done, but it's probably not going to be, it's not going to feel like a finished product or feel as compelling or as engaging as many of the successful indie games, simply because you were coming up with ideas in isolation of one another, just because, you know, well, you were chugging at things, going along, without this overarching vision of what you could be doing in the future. Because that's one of the other aspects of this idea, and why those sorts of games work out well, is because you have a vision of the future. You have a roadmap in your head as to what things are gonna, what ideas you're going to add and look at later, and that allows you to plan ahead, you know, and foresee the mechanics that you're going to implement later, so you can start designing them well. And then that's not even touching on the whole like technical aspect of it, like what you know, how do I design my code base now so that I'm not pulling my hair out in 8 to 12 months or whatever when I'm working, when I have to inevitably have to expand on this.
If you know the answer to that, please tell us, because we're going through that right now.
It's very simple. It's very simple. You need to be able to see the future. You literally need to have the ability to divine the future and foresee everything.
That's why what we're, you know, I think the important thing is for, I mean, at least as far as code goes, is to try to plan. I mean, it's so much as it's possible to try to plan out how your code is going to be laid out so that you attempt to avoid that thing. But I think that, I think that the bottom line is that having purity of vision, I mean, you kind of basically said it, but having purity of vision for an indie is a way of being more efficient.
Absolutely.
Right? Is that you're able to say, well, my game is about this kind of mechanic or this kind of narrative thing. And if you're able to discount anything that you think doesn't work with that, you're not spending your time working on a bunch of stuff you don't need to.
Mm-hmm. The other thing about that is that it's much more of a necessity, I think, for an indie studio to do that, because, as you say, it's much more efficient, and that means that they can really focus their time into the things that matter, so that they can get their game done quicker. In a AAA situation, it's less necessary to do that in order to get the game finished on time, because you're dealing in general with a lot more experienced developers that have, you know, they've got their very specialized field of expertise, so they already know how to work relatively efficiently in any given area. So then it becomes a matter of, well, are we wasting time developing ideas and then only later realizing that they don't work from a usability point of view or something like that? Mm-hmm. Whereas with indie games, it's more just like, this does not express, it does not fit the role that it needed to in this game to make the game I wanted it. Yeah. That sentence didn't really fell apart, but
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I think another good example that just pops into my mind that Andrew was mentioning when I think we were briefly discussing this topic is I guess it's not necessarily the new Doom, but it's, the game called Doom that came out in this decade.
Doom 2016.
Doom 2016. He was saying, because he just picked it up because it was on sale, and he was saying that, like, for the most part, it's really focused and really just like razor, like you're just running around. It's all about shooting and killing monsters, and you're just funneled towards that. But then what he said is that there's also these collectibles that you can look around for, and he said that because they're like upgrades, he felt kind of like compelled to go off and do the less fun thing of just kind of searching around for these upgrades instead of just running through monsters, which is the fun main part of the game. So I think that that's one way where, like, sort of a flaw, I guess you could say, in purity of vision can cause like a suboptimal experience.
Yeah, that's a very good example of it, because I'm not too familiar with the original Doom, but that does not strike me as like collecting items or anything like that. Doesn't really strike me as something that fits with that. Beyond, like, I mean, obviously secrets are a big deal in the old classic FPS games, but yeah, that's like when you say collectibles, I'm imagining like Assassin's Creed feathers.
Yeah, which
like from Assassin's Creed 2 and like that sort of thing.
In the original Doom, the only like collectibles you would get are just like key cards to open doors to progress through.
Yeah, which are necessary to progress.
Yeah. In Doom 2016, Andrew is right that there are certain collectibles that you use to improve your power through the game, but usually those collectibles are in relatively obvious points along the path that the game is putting you on. They also have other collectibles, like little Doom guy figurines that they're just collectibles. So you just get like concept art and stuff for them. So that's definitely an example of an area where it's like, yeah, this is cool and all, like cool concept art, guys, but let me get back to killing demons, please.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that might be not so much a failure of purity of vision, just a failure of the vision itself. Because I suspect that was quite intentional. Because that strikes me as a much more modern design decision. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of modern design decisions in Doom 2016, many of which were very good from a usability point of view and just an engagement point of view. So it seems likely to me that sort of thing was a mechanic that they intended to include, and they thought this will make the game better. And I'm not saying they were right in that respect, just that I think that was probably intentional.
Mm-hmm. And there's definitely like a target audience that's like, oh yeah, collectibles, hell yeah, like let me 100% this game and get all the collectibles and find all the secret areas and stuff like that. But it's not necessarily the core vision of the game. The core vision of the game is there are demons, kill the demons. That is it.
Yeah.
I have a pretty good example of... Actually, I have a question and then an example that I want to provide. So, my question is, do you think that producers are one of the big pain points for adding in things that don't necessarily meet the purity of vision? As an example, the new NHL game comes out soon, and they have a Battle Royale mode in it, which... makes no sense because it's literally just a tournament, which already exists in hockey games. It's just they slap the word Battle Royale on it because that's the hot, trendy new thing. And part of me prays that that's not the developers that did that. That's more EA being like, hey, you should put a Battle Royale in the game because Battle Royales are making a lot of money right now, and we want to make a lot of money. That's my money. Get that money. So I wanted to get your guys' opinion on that. Do you think that producers, do you think that producers hold a majority of the blame for a lack, like purity of vision breaks in game development?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I'd say they do, but not because they want to do that. Just because that's their role on the team, is basically to get things done. and that's not necessarily, that does not align with creating the vision in full as envisioned by whomever holds the vision. In a AAA game, that's nebulous as to who that is. But if it's an indie developer, usually they are the producer. So when it comes to an indie game, the producer is the one that's, I guess, on the hook for making sure that the game is not delayed. So they are almost certainly going to be the one saying, hey, you're wasting time on this mechanic, which the developers immediately say, well, make the game better and more focused on the vision. Yes, but it'll delay it by a month, and we can't allow that. Ultimately,
we don't have the money for that.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that may be true. That's like producers and publishers in general, I think, get a bad rap for this sort of behavior where it's just like, oh, they're like they've got the developers on a leash and they're holding them tight and they're not able to make the game they want to make because they just want their money. And it's like often the release date on a game is going to be set like 8 months in advance, and it's a huge pain in the butt to delay something. Like, they've already invested a huge amount of money in marketing campaigns and all that. So, especially since often the developers will be telling the publishers, yeah, we can get it done by then. And then they can't because their estimates are wrong and something came up and they didn't account for it. And then they go back and they're like, well, we don't have the deliverable as promised. As like, then it's just kind of a mess. But it's not so much the publisher's fault there, I don't think. There are certainly cases where it is, where the publisher's just being, for lack of a better word, when they're just being jerks. But I think the interplay there between the two is a lot more complicated. And just some anecdotal evidence on that was a friend of mine, Alex LaRocque, who also he's one of another graduate from IMD in my year. He works at BioWare. Nice. And it's interesting. Oh, wow. It's interesting hearing about a lot of the things he has to say about the recent games that have been released from BioWare that have issues. Certainly, what was the name of the one that was released not so long ago? The Anthem.
Oh yes.
There was a very good Kotaku article about that, which, as I said, is those sorts of things come up, not so much from the publisher's end of things, but from the developer's end of things. That's also a very good example of dramatic failure of vision from BioWare's point of view. And that's got nothing to do with the producers or the publishers. That's just they didn't know what game they wanted to make, and then they spent 7 years just doing stuff. Mm-hmm. And then 7 years later, they realized we don't have a game because they didn't know what they were making.
It's got jetpacks though.
And
actually, in this case, I would say it's a failure of the producer, not because they were screwing things up, but because they didn't have they weren't holding on to the like getting people to come up with the vision sooner.
Yeah, that's one of the key things in game design. So for anyone here who may have been in Hamilton, you may at Con Bravo last weekend, you may have caught Matt and myself on a couple panels. And one of the things that was discussed was the fail fast concept in game dev, where if you're making like a gameplay mechanic and it just doesn't work, it's better to just scrap it and move on quickly than it is to spend time trying to make a game mechanic that may never work. And I feel like Anthem is one of the big victims of that, where it's like, we got a game with jetpacks and then 7 years later they released it and it flopped because what's the game?
Yeah. It's real sad when something like that happens, especially BioWare. BioWare is a company that has a huge amount of reputation. So when they fail that spectacularly to create something, because their games usually have a very good vision, very focused. In general, like when you think about games like Dragon Age, specifically Origins, I'm thinking of, I feel less inclined in that direction to the sequels, but others may disagree. Mass Effect is another big one that has a great deal of focus in it.
Yeah.
And then you can go further back and look at Knights of the Old Republic 1 and Neverwinter Nights 1, both games that had like a very good sense of tone.
Yes. Knights of the Old Republic for sure had like they knew exactly what they wanted to do with that game. They were like, "Cool, this is the story, this is the tone. Let's just do that. Let's just focus on that, and everything else will fall into place." And it did, and that's why it was such a successful game.
Yeah, and then of course the sequel was made by Obsidian, and it was a bit buggy but really cool, and didn't do so well for Obsidian. I still maintain I think Knights of the Old Republic 2 is I still like that game a lot more than Knights of the Old Republic 1. Not to say Knights of the Old Republic 1 is not a good game, but I feel like that's a good example of purity of vision, at least being visible as a player, because even though that game is arguably incomplete and doesn't have a proper ending, it still felt satisfying for some reason to me.
Yeah,
which I think just goes to show that they had done enough work creating what they had that it supported the non-existent ending.
Yeah, I think that when a game like is about something throughout, and it feels cohesive, and it's exploring, let's say, some idea or some notion, and it's and that notion and those ideas are kind of woven throughout the game. I think that can tie the experience together a lot more. And there's an example in my brain that what was it? What was the thing that I was just... Well, instead I'll talk about Chrono Trigger.
That does not sound like a bad idea.
Chrono Trigger, also very good. And I think that Chrono Trigger has this kind of clarity because it's a game about time travel and stuff, but it's also...
it's got a lot of disparate ideas, but it manages to continually integrate them. Yes. I think that's the big key, is that although it's got robots and it's got like fantasy sorcerers and all these crazy ideas like monsters from beyond the sky, from another world, all of it is, the themes are being constantly reintegrated in, and you can't go too far in that game without those ideas popping up again. And I think that's why it feels cohesive.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I feel like that's a weakness in particularly in like open world games, where it's a lot harder to keep that purity of vision in. Obviously, Breath of the Wild is an exception because
that's why Breath of the Wild is so... Well, the trick is with Breath of the Wild is the purity of vision is present every moment of that game, because what they're trying to convey is this world. It's not like it's some game with some story that, between cutscenes, you're traveling through this world, and then, you go into this place, but you could just go on side quests or whatever. Like, on the surface of it, it seems like that, but when you delve a little deeper, it's... Breath of the Wild is about, what's over there?
Yeah.
Let me check this. I'm looking, hey, there's that thing on the horizon. Look, the sun is setting. It's raining. Just being in this world and having to travel through it is... not having to, wanting to travel through it.
I think open world games are a very interesting discussion point on this topic, because it's very easy to create an open world game that does not feel like it has a confined vision of what it is, and that's often the case with a lot of AAA games. And yet, there's a lot of good examples of AAA open world games and open world games in general that really do. And I think the defining factor is, pick a direction. Whichever direction you go, you're going to run into the same themes again.
Right. Yeah. Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, suffers from not having that, where, you've got your main story, which is, a very, very well-written story about, being a cowboy in the wild, wild west and, all these things are happening to you, and oh god, it's a disaster every time you come up with a plan. It blows up in your face, and this is the end of the wild wild west and stuff like that. And then you go into the open world, and it's you just ride around, rob a train. Even if there's no one near you, some cop like 3 miles away knows it was you that did it. You're the one that robbed that train. So it's an area where Rockstar is trying to go down two separate paths, where you've got like the open world where it's like, oh yeah, you can do anything you want. And then they've got, once you get into the story missions, it's like, no, you got to go to this specific point, and then you're going to talk to this person, and then you're going to ride on your horse to this point, and then you can start the mission, then you're going to shoot some people, and boom, the mission's over. You can now go back to the open world fun time stuff.
An example of that springs to mind immediately for me is Batman Arkham City.
Oh, yeah?
Because I distinctly remember my interaction with that, because that was the first open world game I played where I didn't do any of the side quest stuff. Because the whole game, you keep hearing this voice stab from whoever the bad guy is that's running the city. That's just like, I will activate this evil plan in 10 hours. Which to me just said, there's a time limit. You should do the story missions immediately.
Right.
So I just was like, okay, what's the next story mission? I just basically blitzed the whole game. And then I got to the end. And then I realized that actually it wasn't time sensitive. That was all just fluff. Mm-hmm. And that was when I realized, you cannot really have an open world game with time sensitivity like that unless you're designing for that concept from the start.
Yeah.
Because I truly think an open world game has failed if you just do the story. Mm-hmm. Because that defies the genre. It's like playing a first-person shooter where you're not shooting anything.
Well, that sounds like an interesting game, though.
It does, if you design it that way.
Yeah, if it's specifically designed to be a first-person shooter where you don't shoot anybody.
But if I play your game without engaging in your core defining mechanic, then you have made a grave error.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because something like being an open world game, it's like that's a huge amount of work. That's adding on open world to your game. It's like, oh my god,
you've just added 3 years of development.
I mean, you don't need to tell me that, because Metal Shepherd we originally envisioned as an open game.
Yeah.
And it ended up being basically a linear sort of single level world. Mm-hmm. To try, because we at least managed to capture the feel of an open world game, I feel, but it did not have, it was the illusion of an open world. Because how the hell do you design an open world game when you only have a year? Especially if this is your first game. That's not doable. And even a AAA game is still going to struggle with that sort of a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that kind of cutting down is, well, I mean, very, very common, let's say, obviously. I mean, I think Halen was going to have, some absurd number of levels, and then we're like, how about 3?
Yeah, I think we ended up cutting 1.5 areas from our game. Our estimate wasn't too overboard, I don't think. Despite the fact that the immediate feedback we got from all the professors right on was like, oh, you are never going to have time to develop all these environments. And turns out we only really cut 1, and we just combined 2. So it wasn't too far off the mark. But certainly that's a huge problem. But basically an inevitability in game development is you'll have these ideas and then you'll need to cut them. So you need to.
It's just a fact of life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think. So essentially it boils down to that having like a specific idea, a specific vision for your game is kind of a way of pre-cutting out things, right? Is that ensuring that you kind of cut things out before you make them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of planning, right?
Yeah.
It's always a matter of planning. As long as you plan everything okay, you'll hit your deadlines and your game will probably be good. Probably.
Yeah. Ha ha ha. ha. It's a good one.
I mean, it helps. It helps.
It helps.
I mean, in general, people are usually more productive with deadlines than without.
Yep.
Absolutely true.
Which is why this sort of a thing is helpful, because if you can confine your vision in that way, it gets you one step closer towards being able to say, okay, we're gonna like be done, say, in 2 years, as opposed to I don't know because I don't know what our game's about.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Having a deadline, I can confirm with many things, is key to productivity. Like we got more done on Blobs in 3 weeks than we did in what, like 6 months.
Oh yeah. Same thing with us in senior project. As I recall, the majority of the work got, well, not the majority, but I'd say like a good like 30% of the game came into existence in the last month.
Well, no, I mean that constantly happens to us, where like the first time we were going to show off Blobs, I think it was CNE in Toronto, and we like a week before we were like, oh shit, we like don't have like a game at all. So like in like a week, we went from like nothing to having something that is surprisingly not like all of the main mechanics of Blobs were in. And since then, it was mostly tweaking. So yeah, deadlines are valuable.
Extremely so.
Terrifying, but valuable.
A question for you guys. What is a game that, in your memory, suffers the worst from a lack of vision or a lack of purity of vision? Is there anything in your recent memory that you've played that you've realized this just doesn't work?
It's a good question.
I think that like it's got to be.
I would say that's sorry. I'd say that's a difficult question to answer purely on the basis that a game that doesn't have vision is inherently not memorable.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a fair point.
I mean, I think that it's a hard question.
This isn't a great answer to your question, but one that I do feel is interesting because a game that I very much enjoyed immensely was To the Moon, which is an indie game that's effectively an interactive novel. Visual novel, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Not visual novel, the genre per se, just a story that is visual and linear for the most part, but with interactive elements. And I think it's a wonderful game with a wonderful story, but it does suffer from one problem, which is that the content of the game is routinely interrupted by these mini games where you are piecing together. It's effectively and frankly very out of place puzzle, which feels very distinctly gamey. And I really wish that weren't in that game, because that particular game I have direly wanted my mother to play, and she unfortunately does not have great spatial problem solving skills for that sort of thing. And it's like it's one of those, slide the pieces around and it's not sliding around, sorry, it's like when you click on a column and then the pieces of this sort of jigsaw thing invert, and then your goal is to get them to all match, and she can't do that. And there's like a dozen of these puzzles and they're roughly evenly spaced throughout the whole game, and she just couldn't play it. It's like, I am so frustrated and disappointed by that, because the story of that game is wonderful. And as far as my mother's concerned, it was rendered unplayable as a result of that mechanic, which didn't really add anything to the game at all.
Right.
I think that there's some perception. There's this perception, this innate kind of like thought, I think, in making a game where you're like, oh, well, we can't just like make it too easy, right? There's got to be some kind of like added stuff, more content, more challenge. But sometimes what a game needs is for that stuff to be removed to make it what it ought to be.
Yeah, I think that's an inherent problem with the medium, because games carry with them this idea that they represent challenge.
Yeah.
And that a game can't be any game where you don't have to, when you aren't challenged by something, isn't a game. I've never liked this concept of trying to categorize games as games and not games. Like, are walking simulators games? They don't have challenge in them. You just hold W, and it's like it doesn't matter. It's an experience, and they're going for a certain level of difficulty, and maybe that level of difficulty is non-existent. That's one of the reasons why I love it when text-heavy RPGs like Pillars of Eternity have like a story mode, which they included. I think they patched that in after it was released, but I may be mistaken. And it's basically just, I want to play this game, which has a whole like tactical combat element to it, and I just want to not really worry about that at all and just play the game for the story. I first heard about that from a reviewer called Matt Lees, and he jokingly referred to it as dad mode. It's like that's perfectly legitimate. Not everyone has time for that. But there's this stigma around games being easy, and that's something else which, like, difficulty is a whole other can of worms that can really mess with your purity of vision, because it can make you want to artificially inflate the difficulty of certain areas because you feel it needs to be challenging, or not. I mean, a good example of where difficulty can be used to reinforce your vision, I think, is in the final fight of Dark Souls 1, which I'm not going to say anything too much about, because that's a great game and anyone who hasn't played it should consider playing it, despite the fact it's a difficult game. But the difficulty of that game is something that of that fight is something that is kind of debated amongst people who have played that game, because some would say correctly, perhaps, that's one of the easier fights in the game, and yet my distinct recollection of the first time I played that game and made it to that fight was that it was the hardest fight in the whole game. And perception of challenge, when you are doing it, when you are adjusting the difficulty in your game deliberately with this in mind, can have a profound impact on the way players experience the game, often for the better.
That's definitely.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Something like that's present in something like Hollow Knight, where a certain side boss is like just, oh my god, difficult. But like the quote, we'll say the boss of the game is not nearly that difficult, shall we say?
Yeah. Hollow Knight, good game.
Hollow Knight, good game.
But I would argue, in fact, actually, you've played Hollow Knight and not Dark Souls, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
What I said about Dark Souls' final fight applies to the boss that you're thinking of, I think, in the same sort of way, in that the arguable ease of that fight says something about the fight. It says a lot about that character.
I think that's true. I think that is a good point. I don't, because Hollow Knight's boss, capital B, is appropriately difficult, let's say. But it is like, you get, it's like the classic, like any kind of RPG where it's like, all right, it's time to face the boss. And then you're like, oh. I
mean, I don't know about you, but the first time I fought that character, the boss that isn't the boss with a capital B, it's real hard talking about Hollow Knight, spoiling anything, and I have no idea how coherent this conversation will be. Hasn't played Hollow Knight, or even people that have, but that fight I recall being, from my perspective, it felt difficult, and then I came back to it later and I realized how easy it had become just because I was so much more experienced with the game. And in retrospect, it made the first fight feel easy, which I think is interesting. It's funny how when you go back with more experience later on, especially if the game intends you to do that, it can completely recontextualize the tone of that fight and make it feel utterly different, which is, I think, what very much occurred in Hollow Knight.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, very much intentional.
Yeah, I think you're right. But we probably this is not the Hollow Knight podcast.
I've got an
It
example.
should be.
I've got
Hollow Knight is a great game.
Yeah, I talk a lot about Hollow Knight.
I should really play
But yeah,
Hollow Knight, I guess.
I mean, how do you like platformers?
I don't mind platformers.
How do you like games that are difficult?
I mean, I've tried playing God of War on God of War difficulty and just was displeased by the challenge. I haven't played Dark Souls.
I don't think
mind
that
the
Hollow
challenge.
Knight,
It's just, you know.
I don't think Hollow Knight is so. I mean, depends on the boss, right?
Okay, so difficulties. I'm going to keep this brief because this isn't an episode about difficulty, which could be an entire whole other episode. But difficulty in terms of Hollow Knight's, in terms of how Hollow Knight comes across as a game, is central to that game's vision. And there's a reason why, for instance, and it shares a lot of DNA with Dark Souls. There's a reason why Dark Souls doesn't have another difficulty setting. It's just the game is the game. Deal with it. And that's more or less the case with Hollow Knight.
Well, yeah, in fact, there's a harder mode in Hollow Knight where you have no extra lives.
Oh God,
for sure. I mean, you have to play through the game to unlock that later, so it's not the intended way to play it.
Yeah.
But believe I've tried that; it's brutal. But on that topic, actually, that's something that's kind of interesting. Is that, and this is a big deal in Dark Souls, like the idea of community set just sort of difficulty, like self-induced difficulty of like, there's like the people joke all the time about like Dark Souls runs where I'm just going to do it without touching any of the bonfires. It's just like, why are you inflicting this on yourself? And it's just like, it just changes the tone of the game and makes it feel very different, and can create an entirely different feel.
Oh, you know what? Actually, that reminds me of a very good point about Breath of the Wild, because by default in Breath of the Wild, you're shown a bunch of stuff. Like you're shown a mini map, and you're shown on screen how hot it is and how much noise you're making, and like what time it is. I think maybe I can't 100% remember what that last thing is, but basically, it's shown a bunch of information. And there's a setting in the menu. I think it's like something about the UI. You can set it so that basically all you can see is like what items you have out and like your health. So you don't. If you go into the menu, you still see like how hot it is because that's relevant to whatever. But what that does is, especially the minimap, that's mainly what I'm talking about here, is that not having a minimap in Breath of the Wild completely changes the game. The minimap is an example where I think that was added in that as maybe has diluted the vision of that game, because when you have the minimap, you have a much better sense of like where you are and where you're going and what's going on. But if you don't have it, because the game is full of things like road signs and people being like, oh yeah, that thing. Oh, I heard that there's this thing up on top of the hill over there. Like, it's not like you can't find your way around without the minimap.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes you feel a lot more like you're a person exploring the world, which is what the game is about, rather than with the minimap is like, it kind of just sort of robs you a little bit of that experience, because I played the game the first time with the minimap, not even thinking about turning it off because that was just the default setting. And I never really quite got that experience. And our friend Josh Allen played the game with that off, and he had a much different experience of the game because of that.
Yeah, something in a similar vein that springs to mind is I once played, which game was it? It was Fallout New Vegas, which is an awesome game. I played it without the radio on. And that game actually has a soundtrack, and pretty good one. And the tone of the music, that like the actual soundtrack, is dark and creepy. which is really, really quite tonally different to when you're listening to the radio and you're listening to a lot of old, old music,
50s
and
and 60s doo-wop kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And like all this different kind of, very like setting specific music, compared to this almost cinematic, like dark, almost horror soundtrack. And it felt much more like a horror game. And that was really interesting. That was a very strange experience. And it's well worth just having a go playing that game without the radio on, because it completely changes the nature of that game. Like it doesn't feel like a Fallout game, and that's not a bad thing. It's just very interesting to see what a profound impact that one design decision to just have the ability to, whatever you're doing, whether you're fighting ghouls or going off and just exploring the wasteland, accompanied by this specific set of music. Mm-hmm. There's like actually completely tonally dissonant with what you're doing, but that's the tone. That's the theme of the game.
To go back on David's point about turning off the minimap in Breath of the Wild, you can do that in Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. And if you do turn off the minimap, the NPCs will give you a lot more like description about stuff. So it's like, oh, you should check out this house in this forest to the north of this town, right? And one of the areas where that can really, really succeed for them is that every Rockstar game comes with a map when you buy it. Like if you buy like the physical copy, you get a big map of the world. So you can use the information that you get in game along with the map that Rockstar gives you to figure out where you're supposed to go. The problem is that doesn't work in the story mode. To steal, so I'm to be upfront, I'm blatantly stealing this point from Nakey Jakey's video on Red Dead Redemption 2, which I would absolutely recommend watching. It's fantastic. But he decided to play the game with the mini map off, and he was having a great time until he got to this mission where he stole this wagon. And then it was like, okay, now park the wagon in a secluded location, it said. So he did that. And then, nothing happened. He's like, oh, maybe I have to go farther away or something. So he rode farther away and found another secluded location. And again, the mission didn't finish.
Don't tell me it was a specific secluded location.
It was a specific secluded location that he had to go to. He had to turn the minimap back on so that he could find the specific location that Rockstar wanted him to go because, and I quote, "I'm just a baby. I'm just a dumb baby. How should I know where to park a car?" So that's definitely an area where it's like Rockstar, you've got this really cool thing where it's like, yeah, turn off the HUD and, the NPCs will tell you specific things and, you got this big old map you can use to find stuff. But instead, for the story missions, they're like, nah, we're just going to spell it out for you.
That's really interesting because that says to me that doesn't sound like a vision problem. That's like a QA problem. That sounds like the people that were testing the game knew where the spot was. So even with the minimap turned off, they just go there.
Yeah.
From like that, because that sounds exactly like the same sort of problem which happened at Senior Project Fair with my game, Metal Shepherd, was we had this whole section that was like, oh, there's 3 puzzles here. Complete. And we had tested it and it worked fine, and then someone came up to us afterwards. It's just like, you can just walk through the gate without doing any of the puzzles. There's just no hitbox on it. There's no collider. You can physically just walk straight through that door. And then we're like, oh, didn't occur to us to try that because we knew to do the puzzles.
Oh God.
Yeah.
That's always the thing is like there's no better testing than user testing because you made the game, you know how it's supposed to play. But people will do dumb things.
Yeah.
Or unexpected things where it's just like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's not even dumb things. It's just things that you as a developer would never do because you already are biased by knowing stuff about the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For example, this weekend when we were at Con Bravo, we were showing off, we were playing Blobs, and as I was explaining the controls, one of the things that we have in Blobs is a taunt button. which just kind of plays like a sound effect on a little particle effect over top of you. But gameplay wise, it does nothing. And we just kind of accepted that. And then someone that was playing our game was like, "What if it like buffed your damage?" I was like, "Oh damn, that's a really good idea." Yeah. Why didn't we think of that? That makes so much sense.
Question for you then. Sorry, question for you then on that about that specific thing is: did you not decide to have any any mechanical impact on that because that was implemented earlier, and you're like, "This is cool," and then you just sort of forgot about it?
It's just the opposite.
Really?
Because
we had an open button.
We had an open button, and we were like, taunting is fun. And we have like this, like, I don't know, something like 12 or 13 fun little blob noises. Let's just have a button where you just sort of press it and you make a little noise. That sounds fun. But it's kind of annoying to like, yeah, that's something that I realized when we were explaining the game in Con Bravo, which every time it's like, okay, yeah, and you can taunt, but like it doesn't do anything. It's just a taunt.
That's what I said. Every time I explained it, I was like, yeah, this is just a taunt for funsies.
Yeah, it's interesting from a usability point of view too, because if I'm a player and I'm playing a game I haven't played before, and I hit a button and it has a perceivable effect in the game, my gut assumption is that that's going to be relevant to playing the game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Basically, we saw it like how in some games like Mario Party, where like when it's not your turn, you can just sort of press a button to be like, "You're lousy,"
Yeah.
But yeah, we just kind of threw it in, and then here's the thing, right? Is that imagine you've got your buttons are 3 of the face buttons and the left stick, and it's like I don't know.
Oh yeah, no, I fully understand the decision behind that. I think it's interesting because the reason why that probably occurred is because that wasn't a deliberate decision.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That was like, okay, what are we going to stick in here? And then you're like, we just want it to have an effect. We want you to be able to press that button and something to happen. But it's like you want you don't care what the effect is, but you want an effect to occur. And yeah, because that wasn't part of your vision. You didn't need it. The game might even be more elegant from a design point of view without it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or at least, until you actually start making mechanical, impact from it. But because you decided we should add this, I guess it just wasn't necessarily immediately obvious to you as to how to incorporate that into the focus of what you wanted this game to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think we're going to end up making the taunts do anything. We might improve the effect because it doesn't look great. But anyway, I don't think we're going to add to make it like mechanically do that suggestion, even though I think it's a good suggestion. The problem is that it's a bit complex to express in like a little simple picture. And this is like supposed to be like Blobs is supposed to be just like a really obvious, simple game to play as much as possible, which maybe we haven't quite delivered on that vision, but that was the vision. For it to just be like, it's just so easy and obvious.
Yeah, it's meant to be like a pick up and play kind of game.
So the notion is like, the idea was this. It's like, when you taunt, you do more damage, but you also take more damage because the idea is that you're emboldened, but everyone else doesn't like you now. And it's like, that's fun. But
how do you present that?
Right, because all the other things in the controls page, which is not the most nicely laid out, but it's still pretty simple. It's like, it's one picture per, button input, right? Because all the other moves are so obvious. It's like, this is the jump and the ground pound. This is the dash. This is the block. It's like, you just show a little picture of it and you're like, okay, I vaguely understand. But for taunt, it's hard to
explain that. At least in one picture.
In one picture, yeah.
To close off for the night, I asked you guys the question earlier about what game you thought had lost their vision. And I thought of an example of a whole series that has lost their vision. And that is Sonic. If you think back to the original Sonic games, those games were just like They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and they delivered. And then they decided to make Sonic 3D, and it just doesn't work. It's not the way that Sonic works. It can't be done. Just give up.
Well, that's what happened to a lot of platforming games, or a lot of games, a lot of 2D games. They're just like, well, 3D is a thing now.
Yeah.
3D is better. We will make our game 3D without thinking, hey, does our game's vision
actually work for that?
Work in 3D?
Like Mario worked really well. Because, Mario used to be, side-scrolling 2D, and then Super Mario 64 came out, and that was a goddamn masterpiece. And Super Mario Odyssey came out, and that was a goddamn masterpiece. Sonic, it doesn't really work that well. It's, you follow the path, you go fast, you collect rings, and you did it. You fight Dr. Eggman.
So there's a very interesting video by Errant Signal on this topic. And to summarize that, the idea is that the original 2D Sonic games had a very specific vision, and they're good for that reason. And then they made that transition to 3D, and they were still trying to apply that previous vision to the 3D games, and that just did not work for obvious reasons that you already stated. But then the vision slowly started to morph towards something else. And if I remember correctly, he talks about how the original Sonic games, he posits, were not about speed per se, but about learning the levels and trying to navigate them effectively. And that, for whatever reason, didn't apply to the 3D games, because they were like, oh yeah, it's about speed. And then they did not know how to design around that concept, because they were still trying to make 2D Sonic levels in a 3D space, but with a different direction. And that's why the later games that are full 3D, where it's like you are like, it's like third person following behind Sonic as he runs down basically a raceway, a linear path, real fast. That's why those games are better. Because they're like, okay, ditch all this idea about platforming and navigating 3D environments. It's not about that. It's about moving real fast. And that's an example of them just shifting their vision and then realizing this is how we need to design our games, and we need to toss out all of the vestiges of the previous entries in the series, because they do not match this vision anymore.
I mean, the area where I disagree with that is because they actually, I don't know if they released Sonic Mania or like some other developer released Sonic Mania. I don't really know exactly how that works. But I know that Sonic Mania is, it went back to the old school 2D style side. Would you call that a side scroller? I guess.
Of course.
Yeah.
Side-scrolling platformer.
Yeah. And I mean, Sonic Mania is a really fun game to play. Granted, a lot of the levels in the game are, straight up ripped from the old game and just kind of like redesigned and reimagined a little bit. But it's still like, maybe it's my nostalgia talking a lot, because I played Sonic a lot when I was a kid, and then I played like the 3D Sonics and just wasn't very into it. And then I got Sonic Mania and I was like, ooh, damn, this is a spicy meatball. I like this.
I mean, I imagine you feel that way for the same reason that I really do not like the later Dragon Age games. Because my experience with Dragon Age Origins was incredibly profound, because that game is based on older CRPGs. And then they deviated from that and they went more towards the Mass Effect route of things, which just felt wrong to me.
Yeah. I mean,
and many people would say that the later games are good games, but they don't feel good to me.
Yeah, I think that this is part of like a bigger issue, which maybe can be the next topic, but this notion of games, sometimes games can kind of get caught in themselves, if you know what I mean. Like, yes, Sonic Mania is like you could say it's a return to form, and I've been told it's a very good game. But at the same time, is it doing really anything new? I don't think so.
Sounds like a victory lap.
Yeah,
that's a fair point.
That's definitely a piece of criticism that can sort of, I would say kind of, but a little bit definitely be leveled at game series like Zelda, where even though I love the Zelda games, but so many of them are retreading very you could say well-worn ground. A lot of games are doing. I mean, Zelda is obviously not even nearly one of the worst criminals in this era. In this,
The worst one
realm.
for that, in my opinion, is Far Cry.
Or what about all the EA sports games? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not even it's not even a contest. I
It's
mean, why am I
not even
bringing
a
up Zelda?
contest.
Zelda's not even like close to being that bad.
I mean, my understanding for any of the sports games is that the people that buy them are buying them for the rustage, not because they care. They are expecting any kind of mechanical changes.
Yeah,
I
it's
can give
just
you-
a different audience that
I-
plays those than who plays core AAA games.
as
Tyson?
someone who has bought NHL every year since oh god, let's see, first one I played was in '93. But that was
Well,
it was 4 years old. I played NHL '93, but that was in like 1997. And then I'd say probably around 1999, 2000, I've owned every single NHL game.
And what do you think about the fact that they're very similar?
This is the problem. Younger me is like, oh cool, new NHL game. They add some new features. This is fun, you know. The big thing for me for buying that game is that it's not so much about playing the game itself, it's about who I play the game with. So my brother and I have played the NHL games together since we were little kids. So, you know, every year we play that game together. So for me, it's not so much about, you know, like, oh, I gotta buy the game because it's the new game. It's more, you know, a return to tradition where it's like, okay, cool, new NHL game. My brother and I are both going to get it, and we're going to play this game together.
Yeah, there's a social element there I can't relate to, but that's certainly a very profound factor in purchasing decisions.
Yeah. So,
And that's, I imagine, something they rely on, that exact
Yes,
source of
exactly.
nostalgia and tradition.
Exactly. So for me, like, I've been debating for the last couple of years whether I want to continue buying the games, and it's like, oh, I'm not going to buy it this year, and then I wind up being a lying whore and buying the game anyway because that's just who I am. So you know, it's an area where like I can understand the criticism for it, especially once I play the game for a little while, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is very similar to the last game. Like the same way you can score goals in a game 2 years ago, you can still do it. So I can definitely understand that criticism, but for me, it's not so much about the gameplay; it's about who I'm playing the game with. It's a reason for us to, you know, hang out and play games and have fun.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's definitely super important in games like that. Which, to the extent that games like the NHL games or any of the other EA games, that's probably it almost sort of disqualifies them from this debate because it's like, I bet the people who they're making it for, if they, let's say I don't know, NHL 2020, which, wait, is that one out yet or not out
It's
yet?
coming out next month.
Okay, perfect. NHL 2020. Imagine they release it and it's like, bam! It's a brand new NHL 2020 experience. Everything's different. All the mechanics are improved and changed, and everything's different and not the same as you remember it when you were 5. I think people would get mad.
Yeah, there's certainly expectation there. That's really interesting because that's almost paradoxical as we talk about like the difference between innovation and iteration, about doing the same idea over and over again and gradually refining it and changing it and making it better versus coming up with new mechanics and experimenting and creating a completely different game with the same name. That's just something that completely defies this kind of conversation because it's like, no, not only do the developers quite happily want to do the same thing over and over because it requires less effort, but the customers want the same game over and over.
It's almost like, you know, it's been like, you know how like these days, you know, games get like patches, or like you know, content. It's like, oh, you can buy a new, like you can buy, oh, now there's the new roster, right? Like you could imagine an NHL game where they just release, the game is called NHL.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, every year it's like, oh, there's some update, you know, some content changes or some mechanics are upgraded.
So you're talking about Destiny 1.
Damn.
Honestly, I'd be okay with that. If I paid like 60
The way
bucks
they sold that product, it
if
will
I-
last for 10 years. And it will
I don't
just be
want to talk
updated.
about Destiny.
I'd be totally okay with that. If I paid like 70 bucks for, just NHL, and then every year, they might charge like 30 bucks to be like, oh yeah, here's like, some new features that we've added in. Or,
I mean, for sure.
like
I'm
new
sure
roster.
every customer will be happy to spend 30 bucks in place of 80 bucks.
Exactly.
But the publishers aren't going to do that because everyone seems to be happy paying 80 bucks.
Exactly. Why would they?
But
Don't
at
break,
the same
don't
time,
break what ain't fixed.
At the
What?
same time, it's almost in a way. I mean, maybe not, but you could see it as it's almost cheaper for the consumer. Let's say I'm Joe Xbox, and I've
think I
never
know that
played
guy.
an NHL game before, and I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm going to pick up NHL 2020, and so I pick up NHL 2020, and my assumption is that it's, I'm paying whatever 70 or whatever video game AAA video games cost nowadays. I don't even know. I pay whatever this exorbitant fee is, and I'm presumably getting like all the stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting all the game. Whereas, I don't know, my cousin Bill Xbox, he bought this NHL game, so he paid that same price. But then he's like, hey, this year I want to get the new thing. So he pays the 30 bucks. But then he's paying, but I guess it's, I don't know, whatever. Let's just abandon this this whole thought exercise. I think don't worry about it.
In a vague attempt to just salvage the kernel of,
Please do.
my guess is that if you're jumping in on this train, you're probably going to gravitate towards the newest iteration because you're like, that's going to be the best, right? Because they've like been doing this for 20 years. They've reached this point now, and it's probably the best that this genre is going to be. This series, I say genre, I mean it may as well be. This series is going to be. So that's when they jump in, and then they get I don't want to say lured because that implies that there's some sort of predatory element to this, and maybe there isn't. I honestly don't know enough about it to say so.
No, definitely.
But there you go. He said it, not me. But you get lured into this the cyclical pattern of buying the next release. I just find that very amusing because we heavily criticize like good examples like Call of Duty and Battlefield for doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And yet we expect them to iterate and not change mechanics that we liked. Or when I don't know a huge amount about those particular series either because I haven't played too much of them, but it's the same sort of idea behind them, but not accepted.
I think that talking about sequels as expectations, like, what do you expect from a sequel, right? How much do you expect to be the same? How much do you expect to be different? That's also a good topic. Mm-hmm. But I've also remembered the key point that I was trying to say in my weird metaphor thing, which is, so me as, I don't know, what was my name again? Joe Xbox? Yeah. Whatever. So Joe Xbox has two choices, right? He can jump in at the ground floor and buy the, let's say 70 bucks. Let's say it's 70 bucks. It might be more. He pays 70 bucks for the, NHL 2020, right? And he's set. He's good to go. But in this alternate reality, Joe Xbox is like, well, NHL came out like, let's say 2 years ago for 70 bucks. But then if I want to get the latest game, if I want to get this year's roster, I'm going to have to pay an additional 30 bucks. So that's $100 to get the latest game versus 70 bucks to get the latest game. So in this specific weird instance where I'm only going to be buying one version of this game, in that context, a new game every year is cheaper for me. Mm-hmm. But then if Joe next year is like, hey, you know what, I'm gonna get more, then he's paying another 70 bucks. So he's up to $140 in this Enterprise versus he's at 130, which is actually not that big a difference. But it changes. Whatever. You get the point. You see what I was trying to say?
The point is that the longer you're invested in a series, the more you're going to pay.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that's a dumb point, obviously.
Well, not exactly, because there's a lot of psychology behind this sort of thing, and it is interesting seeing that this psychology is very different for a series like NHL or any other sports game or racing games, also very similar to that in this respect, and completely different from most of the other core AAA games. And again, I think in part that's just because it has a very different audience. So the demographic that buys it has a lot of different expectations and purchasing patterns.
Yeah. Speaking of purity of vision, and cutting out features that are good, but but that don't serve the core thing. This is a great discussion. I think we've gotten a little bit off track.
Just a little bit off topic.
So we should probably wrap up at this point.
If you guys have anything else to add in, I think this would be a good place to call it.
I mean, if you let us talk, then we'll be here for another hour.
Yeah, and I think we'll save.
David and I, in particular, can talk forever.
Yes, I'm very much aware. I think that's where we'll call it for tonight. Thank you very much, Max, for joining in on the.
No worries,
podcast.
no worries. Happy to spend time with my friends from SkyPyre.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and we will see you next time.
See ya.
Take care.